Here's what you're missing over at patreon.com/Addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we're dealing with what we call today PTSD, but we're talking about it in the Civil War. And we've got an array of smart people in the room. Smarter than myself and Dustin, our new producer. So let's see. We've got Rob Abbott. We've got Andy. I didn't catch your last name, Andy.
Hart, H-A-R-T.
Andy Hart, and of course Rick Schroeder and Tracy Baer, and then Dustin Harmer, our new producer.
Yes.
And so welcome, everybody.
Thanks.
First, what I'm going to do is turn this over to Rob Abbott. Rob's going to explain exactly what the scope of this episode is going to be, because we want to be very careful with this subject here. So, Rob, go ahead. Take it away.
Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about war trauma, and we're not going to make any linkage to what's going on today with our current veterans.
Right.
None of us in this room are certified mental health professionals. The stuff we're going to talk about is the stuff that's coming out of the historical record. It's coming out of the soldiers' accounts and the phenomena of what's happening before the battle, after the war is over with. So if anybody's having issues, this podcast isn't going to fix it.
Right.
So if you have issues and you're in crisis, call 988. And if you're not in crisis, call your VA, and they'll be more than happy. The Veterans Administration will be more than happy to help you out.
And 988 is the National Suicide Hotline?
That is correct.
Okay. So, yeah. So, definitely if you're in crisis, that's the number you want to call.
Okay.
Otherwise, VA.
All right. So those are the ground rules. So, everybody in listener land, if you send questions linking it, we're not going to answer them.
Right.
So we're just not going to talk about that.
Yeah. I'll refer you to someone who could help you or something like that if we know somebody. But yeah, for the most part, we can't help you with that.
Okay, so let me make the linkage. This is a Gettysburg podcast, so let me make the linkage to Gettysburg. So most of you have been here. You've been around the battlefield. You've driven the avenues, walked around. You looked, seen the monuments. 1,324 monuments, I think, at last count. And we look at those monuments and we think these are triumphant, over the top, we won the war monuments, where really these monuments are here to help the soldiers deal with post-war trauma. So when these regiments start, when the war starts, these regiments have 1,000 guys, 10 companies of 100 each. These are locally recruited regiments. They're like National Guard would be today. They're all from the same hometown. They're all friends, relatives, neighbors. They're all people they know. Not like our active duty military today, where everybody's all mixed in together from all over the country. And they're going to march off to war. Why? Because they're afraid to not march off to war. You know, when everybody in town signs up, you don't want to be the guy that stays behind. That doesn't play well with the ladies. So they're all gonna go. So they're all gonna fight. So they start with 1,000 guys. By the time they make it to Gettysburg, on average, these regiments are down to 300 men. Union is 330, Confederates are 310, according to the Park Service. So where'd they all go? Well, they've been in some battles. They've had some killed and wounded. They've had some guys run away, but not as many as you think, because you're all from the same hometown, and that kind of makes 4th of July picnic a little awkward when these guys show back up again. Where the majority go is disease. Is simple diseases like measles and smallpox. The biggest killer of Civil War soldiers is dysentery. So, they're not combat casualties. They're dead. Mm-hmm. They're just as dead as if they got hit with a .58 caliber ball. They're friends, relatives, neighbors, and they're gone. They're not going home. So they're going to fight here, and when Gettysburg is over with, they're going to do Gettysburg all over again, like 7 or 8 more times. Between Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor and Petersburg. I mean, we look at this battle as something happening in a vacuum. We don't look at it, what happens prior to the battle and what happens after the battle.
Yeah.
They're going to live through this nightmare probably 14 times during the course of this war. So there, I got 300 guys here at Gettysburg. By the time they make it to Appomattox or Bentonville, the average regiment is down to 70 men out of 1,000.
Jesus.
So what's the possibility that any of those 70 men and women make it across the finish line without post-traumatic stress disorder? 0?
I say 0.
Kelvin? Absolute 0? I find it impossible that they are untouched by this. So these monuments go up around the 1880, 1890 time frame. Why? Because these kids are poor. They have no money. These monuments are largely paid for by the veterans. They have to have a career. They have to raise the money. So when they decide to put the monuments up, they have to go to the War Department. They have to get permission. They have to submit a plan and say, this is what we want it to look like. Here's where we want it to go. Here's what we want it to say. And the Monument Commission will modify it because both sides want very angry and vindictive monuments because there's a lot of angry veterans. And once it gets approved, then they have to find a sculptor, and they have to get it costed out, and then they've got to ride around the state of Minnesota and collect money, like real money. It's not Venmo and PayPal. They have to collect real money, and they have to go pay it to a sculptor, and the sculptor will create the monument, and they're going to transport it from Minneapolis or Red Wing or wherever, and it's going to get brought to Gettysburg, and they're going to put it up, and they're going to have to pick a day, and they're going to bring the survivors together. So, you know, when life expectancy is 38, how many of those 70 guys are left after 20, 30 years? What, half? You look at the reunion photos.
Right.
20, 30 guys. They're going to bring those veterans together, and they're going to come together, and they're going to give speeches, and they're going to tell stories, and there's probably some alcohol involved. And they're going to lay hands on the monuments, and they're going to remember the people that they lost, because they lost a lot of guys. And these monuments become critical in the healing of post-traumatic stress. These monuments provide closure. They provide some sense of what their sacrifice meant. So when people look at these monuments, they're not here for triumph. They're here to heal the soldiers. And over to Rick.
But that's an interesting point, though, about the monuments, though. I've never really heard anybody say that it's like it's a healing thing for the soldiers themselves. 'Cause usually it's kind of presented as not so much a triumph type of a thing, but, you know, like it sort of is. You know, this is our big victory. It was on our turf, and we turned the Confederates back, and hurrah. But there's that whole aspect that I've never heard anybody say before, and that's very interesting to me. All right, Rick.
Well, and I think you can see why there's a continual draw to come back to the reunions, to come back to this core group of fellow survivors, because it's just what you said, Rob. They're still dealing with what they had happen to them or what they had happen around them. What I want to do is just as the doctor in the room, I just want to put PTSD and mental health issues in perspective here. Matt, we've been on your podcast and talked about the glamorous things that people want to hear about, like surgery and anesthesia. But if you talk about medical or health care, medical care in the Civil War, surgery and anesthesia, we're talking about, remember, only one third of people died of wounds in the Civil War. So a large portion of this we're not going to deal with today. Medical illnesses, things like typhoid and dysentery, diarrhea, malaria, even traumatic accidents, drownings, lightning strikes. But the subset of mental health is a third subset if we look at medical care. And we're going to talk about this, but PTSD is just part of the overall mental health issues that these veterans, and Tracy's going to talk about the civilians, it affected them. If your spouse dies, if your father dies, if your spouse comes back with one arm, or spouse comes back an alcoholic, a schizophrenic, it's going to affect a lot of people. So PTSD is one aspect of it, but there are other aspects of mental health during and after the Civil War that are a problem. Things like substance abuse, drug abuse, and alcohol abuse were huge problems in the United States after the Civil War. What we call affective disorders, depression. There were other terms for it back then, but just as we deal with it now, it was being dealt with maybe even more significantly back then. And then truly what we call psychoses, or the insanity diagnosis that a lot of these men or even their spouses faced. And tragically, when you read about mental health issues in the Civil War, the specter of suicide comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Just as it's something that we know about today, it was as much or more well known about back then. So, and even things like traumatic brain injury, concussive effects, which we know in our society familiarly as CTE, that contact athletes suffer. I mean, that's all part of the mental health care after the Civil War as well.
I always wondered, and maybe we don't know this, but you're in a battle. There's cannons going on. There's muskets going on everywhere. That's got to be shaking your brain up.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, even if you never were physically wounded, I mean, I would imagine that would do something.
Yeah. I think there's only so many discharges from your Napoleon, your 12-pound Napoleon, that you can take without it starting to scramble the... it's kind of like making tackles out in the flat, you know?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
It happens. And it's very interesting. We see the results of that in contact athletes in Major League Sports and college sports. The same thing was happening to families after the Civil War in terms of risk of suicide or self-murder,
right,
as some of the books call it.
Self-murder, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, there's plenty of accounts in the historical record talking about soldiers that are not a scratch on them and they're dead.
Right.
Okay.
So, because when these artillery shells go off, the explosive effect of that stuff passing through your head is probably not good for you.
Probably not.
And it's not just one cannon, it's a significant amount of cannons that are firing at the same time,
Yeah.
which
And
is
when
going to obviously have an effect.
When you have accounts that you can hear the cannonade prior to Pickett's charge as far away as Pittsburgh, what must that noise have been like here?
Here, yeah.
And the famous sharpshooter...
I can't imagine that.
The famous sharpshooter picture in Devil's Den may be... There's no outward marks on that man's body, as I understand it. Maybe it was a concussive effect.
But he was dragged there, though.
He was.
Yeah.
He was. But he was in the rocky area of Devil's Den.
But that was the other thing that made me think when Rob was saying, because I thought I heard that there were guys who would just either pass out or just drop dead from being in the boulders and the concussion of the muskets or a shell exploding overhead or something like that would just wreck their brain. Yeah. Okay. So go ahead.
I think that it's important to realize while we focus, inappropriately so, on the men who fought in Gettysburg, and Rob correctly said this, is this goes on not just for the rest of the Civil War, but for the rest of these men's lives, but it also goes on in their families' lives, in their communities' lives. It's not something that once the war ends, we have the grand review in May in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue, and everybody goes home happy. Although it's very interesting, when you read about this, there is some gist that that's one of the reasons the Confederates might have had more troubles. They didn't get a parade to welcome them back. There have been other conflicts where that's been discussed.
Yeah, and let me throw in men and women's,
Right.
because there are women out here. Mary Tepe will take her own life later.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, the Rivendière,
Yeah.
114th. So there are women out here.
So yeah. All right. That's interesting. I didn't know that she killed herself. Yeah. Okay. So when the war ends and you bring up the Grand Review, and then the Confederates didn't have anything like that. After the Grand Review, though, is it just see you guys and everybody just leaves? Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.